Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're taking a massive, deeply complex piece of Middle Eastern history and distilling 25 years of geopolitics into one clear visual narrative. We're going to look at the structural rise, the shifting internal dynamics, and the sudden, truly dramatic collapse of the South Lebanon Army, or the SLA. This was a proxy militia that sat right at the incredibly volatile intersection of Israeli security, Lebanese state collapse, and the rise of Hezbollah. Okay, let's dive right into this.
To make sense of all this dense history, we've broken it down into 6 logical chapters. First, the genesis of the SLA. Second, shifting demographics. Third, the intelligence war. Fourth, the assassination of Aql Hashem. Fifth, the 2000 withdrawal. And finally, the aftermath.
Chapter 1, Genesis of the SLA, Out of the Chaos. To really understand the SLA, you have to understand the sheer geopolitical vacuum of the 1970s. When the Lebanese Civil War erupted back in 1975, the central state essentially just evaporated. For local communities in southern Lebanon, suddenly trapped between Palestinian armed factions, regional powers, and armed Islamist groups, well, the conflict wasn't just ideological anymore. It was a matter of sheer existential survival. So the state collapses in 75. By 1976, local Lebanese army officers, most notably Major Saad Haddad, were pushed to the absolute brink and established a direct liaison with Aql, which was the Israeli military's planning unit. The motives were clear. Israel wanted a buffer zone to stop cross-border attacks, and Haddad, he just wanted weapons and backing to survive. In 1978, Israel's Operation Litani cleared out PLO strongholds, which allowed Haddad's forces to secure a continuous border strip. And by April 1979, Haddad actually formally proclaimed the area the State of Free Lebanon, officially breaking away from the government in Beirut. But, this local dynamic was very quickly overshadowed by much larger regional players, specifically the creeping influence of Syrian figures like Hafez al-Assad and Vice President Abdul Halim Khaddam, who would later heavily support Hezbollah's resistance against this exact proxy setup. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast between the two men who led this force. When Saad Haddad sadly died of cancer in 1984, Israel brought in a retired, highly credentialed Lebanese army general named Antoine Lahad to take over, and Lahad completely transformed the militia. He moved it from an ad hoc, volunteer, primarily Christian group defending local villages into a highly institutionalized, really complex pseudo-army. Lahad even managed to secure funding from both the Israeli Defense Ministry, we're talking to the tune of $35 million annually, and the Lebanese Treasury, all while implementing strict compulsory military conscription. Moving on to Chapter 2, Demographics and Shifting Loyalties, a Complex Makeup. So who were the foot soldiers actually wearing the uniforms and manning the checkpoints during the Lahad era? Historically, the SLA is often shorthanded as just a purely Christian militia, but it absolutely wasn't a monolith. By the late 1990s, while Christians made up about 50% of the force, Shia Muslims actually accounted for 30%, Druze 13%, and Sunni Muslims 7%. So the SLA really reflected the regional confessional diversity of southern Lebanon. And this demographic reality is absolutely crucial to understanding the internal fractures that eventually tore the whole militia apart from the inside. But this raises a really glaring question, right? If this was an occupying proxy force facing fierce local resistance, how on earth did Lahad maintain a troop strength of around 2,500 to 3,000 men? Well, the answer lies in severe economic dependency and really harsh coercion. In a region that was economically devastated by decades of war, the SLA offered salaries between $500 and $800 a month. That was often literally the only steady income available. But when money wasn't enough, they used force. Under a military decree, all males over 18 were conscripted. If a family refused or if a soldier deserted, the SLA would often just confiscate their property and expel the entire family from the security zone. And tragically, there was also systematic child recruitment, with boys as young as 11 to 13 forced into military duties. This brutal coercion effectively kept the ranks full, sure, but it completely hollowed out any genuine loyalty to the cause. Which brings us to Chapter 3, the intelligence war, fighting blind. Think about it. When your army is filled with people who don't actually want to be there, you create massive security vulnerabilities. And this sparked a hidden, truly deadly intelligence war. By the mid to late 1990s, the primary adversary in the South was no longer the PLO, it was Hezbollah. And Hezbollah basically executed a masterclass in asymmetric warfare by asking one simple question: how do we turn the SLA's coerced ranks against their Israeli sponsors? While Israeli intelligence was rigidly analyzing Hezbollah through a conventional counterterrorism lens, essentially fighting blind, Hezbollah's counterintelligence unit, al-Mudad, went to work. This operation was largely under the strategic influence and command of Khalil Harb, whose role during these final years was pivotal, and he was backed heavily by Safy Addin on Hezbollah's executive council. Harb's network expertly weaponized the SLA's demographic shift. By exploiting the grievances of those coerced Shia conscripts we just talked about, Hezbollah recruited a massive network of double agents right inside the SLA. The climax of this intelligence failure happened in February 1999 when SLA leaks provided Hezbollah with the highly classified itinerary of Israeli Brigadier General Erez Gerstein. He was killed in a targeted roadside bomb ambush. The penetration was so deep, guys, that the Israeli military actually had to stop sharing troop movements with their own proxy force. The SLA was rapidly becoming militarily obsolete.
Chapter 4: Assassination of Aql Hashem, the fracture. So the crucial point here is that as the intelligence war eroded the militia's foundations, one specific, pivotal event served as the psychological death blow. Colonel Aql Hashem wasn't just any officer. He commanded the Western Brigade, he was the head of the SLA's feared security apparatus, he spoke fluent Hebrew, and he was widely considered the inevitable successor to the aging General Lahad. For the rank and file, Hashem was basically the untouchable strongman keeping the entire operation glued together.
But on January 30th, 2000, Hezbollah struck. They detonated a remote-controlled bomb at Hashem's private farm in the village of Tebel. But here's the thing, they didn't just kill him. They actually filmed the entire operation and broadcast it on their television station, Al-Manar. This was a brilliant tactical masterstroke, overseen by commanders like Khalil Harb, showcasing Hezbollah's absolute intelligence dominance over the SLA in its final months. The psychological impact on the SLA was absolute devastation. I mean, if their top intelligence chief couldn't even protect himself in his own backyard, every single militiaman suddenly realized they were entirely defenseless.
Let's look at Chapter 5, the 2000 withdrawal, a cascading collapse.
Let's move to this timeline and see how this builds into a total collapse in a matter of days. With morale shattered and Israel bleeding casualties, the stage was set for a domino effect. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak had publicly pledged a unilateral withdrawal by July 2000. Trying to minimize their own casualties in those final weeks, the Israeli military began transferring forward outposts over the SLA in mid-May. But the SLA, utterly terrified of facing Hezbollah alone, panicked. They immediately abandoned the outposts. Civilians and Hezbollah fighters marched right in. And this relentless military pressure, orchestrated by Hezbollah on the ground, was heavily backed by Syrian political cover from Hafiz al-Assad and Abdel Halim Khaddam in Damascus. This combined pressure ultimately forced Barak's hand to advance the timeline, and the Israeli army rapidly evacuated across the border in the middle of the night, completely finishing the pullout on May 24th, 6 weeks out of schedule. As this quote from an analysis by the Middle East Forum points out, the collapse of the SLA was not due to its weakness, but rather a direct result of Barak's pledge to withdraw unilaterally. SLA members, aware of their organization's dependence on Israel, realized that without Israel's support, their cause was lost. The proxy literally just could not exist without its sponsor.
And finally, Chapter 6, the aftermath. What happens to the proxies?
The Israeli army was gone, but what happened to the thousands of Lebanese militias and their families left standing on the border? 1,500. That is the number of SLA fighters who immediately flooded the gates at the Israeli border, desperately seeking asylum. Along with their wives, children, and dependents, over 6,000 Lebanese citizens suddenly crossed into northern Israel as refugees, leaving their ancestral homes behind overnight. But what about those who stayed behind? Many expected a massive sectarian bloodbath. But surprisingly, it didn't happen. Hezbollah, calculating the immense domestic political capital they had just won, ordered their fighters not to exact revenge on the streets. Instead, surrendered SLA troops were handed directly over to the Lebanese armed forces to face state military trials.
And this brilliantly illustrates the highly divergent fates of the SLA members. Because so many rank and file were coerced or basically just joined for a paycheck, Lebanese courts handed out relatively light sentences of 1 to 2 years. Senior commanders, however, like Antoine Lahad, faced death sentences in absentia. For the exiles who fled to Israel, they faced decades of profound cultural isolation and intense struggles with housing and assimilation. Meanwhile, back in Lebanon, Hezbollah used that post-withdrawal vacuum to deeply penetrate the Lebanese state security apparatus. Figures like Hezbollah's Khalil Harb capitalized on this exact moment to solidify the group's grip on the south, essentially replacing the SLA's entire security architecture with their own. So, the story of the South Lebanon Army is truly a masterclass in the complexities of geopolitical alliances, from local villagers just seeking protection to an institutionalized pseudo-army, to a hollowed-out force entirely undone by intelligence failures and changing political winds. Right after this withdrawal, Hassan Nasrallah delivered his now famous Spider's Web speech. His thesis was that Israel, despite its massive conventional military and nuclear arsenal, was actually weaker than a spider's web because its society simply could not tolerate casualties. The total overnight collapse of the SLA was held up as the ultimate proof of this thesis, which leaves us with a final thought to ponder today. When a great power decides it's time to pack up and exit the battlefield, what is the true generational cost borne by the local proxies they leave behind? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the history behind the headlines.